International Edition is made possible in part by the Hilton Hotels Corporation, America's business address, and its subsidiary, Conrad International Hotels, the world's business address, and by the members of Maryland Public Television.
This week, we speak with journalists from Germany, Australia, and Britain about top news stories, including Soviet statements on arms control and the CIA's manual for neutralizing officials in Nicaragua. We'll hear reports on America's uncertain welcome in Latin America, on political realignment in the presidential campaign, and a special feature on American soldiers for hire, next on International Edition.
International Edition, a weekly look at America as seen in news reports from around the world.
The Americans said the talks covered such topics as the arms race, Washington, Amerikas Minister Nordbrand Weinberg.
Bonsoir, ici Jean Boisjoli qui vous souhaite la bienvenue.
The host of International Edition is Ford Rowan.
In recent days, the Soviet leader, Konstantin Chernenko, gave an unusual interview on the prospects for improved U.S.-Soviet relations. The Reagan administration rejected Chernenko's claim that Reagan was to blame for lack of progress in arms control, but it welcomed the tone of the Soviets' comments. Dieter Kronzucker of the West German network ZDF, is this some sort of breakthrough or no?
It's first of all a point in favor of democracy, because it shows that a totalitarian power like the Soviet Union can become a participant in the American electoral process. We Germans think, of course, that Ronald Reagan should take up this opportunity, even if it's risky.
Let me get an Australian view. Jenni Hewett of the Sydney Morning Herald. Do you think this is anything new from the Soviets' point of view, or is it an effort to pressure Reagan, or how do you evaluate it?
Well, obviously there's nothing new in the actual proposals, but what is interesting is the timing of the publicity given to it just before the second foreign policy debate, and obviously trying to use this as an opportunity for Reagan, but also as a pressure on him.
Martin Bell of the BBC, do you believe that this is aimed at the American electorate?
Oh, of course it is. There are no keener students of the American political process than the power mongers in the Kremlin. At the same time, I think they feel that they haven't been able to move the Reagan administration through conventional diplomacy, and the way to do it, as very often American politicians to do it, is by an appeal to public opinion, and that's what we're seeing this week.
Who does this put the most pressure on, Reagan or Mondale?
On both, of course, because Mondale has to be very careful not to be the one to have become the image, to be the one to ask the questions of the Kremlin. And for Reagan, he, especially in context with us Europeans, he has to give himself the air, at least, of being all in favor of it.
But I think we're playing political games here, and the Russians are joining in. No one's kidding themselves that anything is going to happen before the second week in November, for sure.
But no one can now say that it's the Russians' fault and then that they're not talking.
That is interesting, and I'd like to ask about another issue that's come up in the American political campaign, namely the controversy over that CIA manual about how to help the Nicaraguan insurgents, and it suggested assassination, among other things. Did this present any surprises to any of you from your knowledge of the CIA in that region?
It sounds pretty low-level stuff to me, but what you have, I think, more or less historically here, is a fairly untamed intelligence network which seems to have a remarkable license to get up to all kinds of tricks, but I would expect this to be disavowed on a pretty massive scale at a very high level.
Well, the last time that the CIA was involved in anything like this, a few years ago when they had the investigation into the alleged assassination plots, the CIA was called a rogue elephant by some on the Hill. Do you believe it's a rogue elephant? Dieter, you've covered Central America.
Well, it puts me in a discrepancy as a reporter out of the United States, first of all, because after being 4 years here, I agree with Martin Bell that it could be a phony, just a fad that goes away with the next debate. But on the other hand, the Europeans are hopping on it because they think it's some sensational news coming up, making this a horse race in the United States.
Well, I think it is obviously part of a pattern of the CIA, although it is in a different category, for example, to the mining of the harbours in Nicaragua. But it just adds to the general impression around the world that the CIA is out of control.
Well, isn't it? I mean, I really think that nothing, apparently nothing has changed. If it's still possible for things like that filter through, then the organization somehow is not in order.
Martin, what's your feeling? You've covered Central America, you know what's happening down there. Do you believe that the CIA is somehow out of control?
It doesn't seem to be answerable to the legislative and executive authority, perhaps in the same way that the security services in other countries are, but of course it benefits from its secret status. I would expect there to be some tightening up. There has to be, as a matter of political prudence.
I'd like to move from the subject of Nicaragua, where the United States opposes the government, to El Salvador, where we support the government. Martin has prepared a report on the meeting in La Palma in El Salvador between President Jose Napoleon Duarte and the guerrilla leaders. Here is the BBC report.
It was late afternoon. A thunderstorm was threatening, and on the steps of the church where the talks were held, one of President Duarte's ministers, Chavez Mena, read out a communique which sounded like a turning point in the war. A peace process was now beginning to be carried forward by a peace commission with 4 members from each side. At that point, the weather broke, and the thousands of Salvadorans who had made the pilgrimage of peace to La Palma stood their ground in the pouring rain and waited for the negotiators. One of the guerrillas' commanders, Fermín Cienfuegos, spoke for the Combat Alliance, the FMLN. We all want peace, he said, and from this day, all Salvadoran people would start to discuss solutions. Peace was the guerrillas' objective, he said. The commandantes then left for their camps in the mountains and their political representatives for their exile in Panama City. For the government side, President Duarte promised them amnesty if they would join in the political process, perhaps in the assembly elections to take place in March. Another encouraging feature of the meeting is that in such an armed camp as El Salvador is, its security guard was successfully provided by the Boy Scouts and the escort for the guerrillas by the Red Cross, and the arrangements worked. However, formidable obstacles remain. There are factions on the left which believe in the continued armed struggle, just as there are groups on the right which charge President Duarte with selling out to the communists just for taking part in the talks. And the war will continue along with the peace process, for no ceasefire was agreed at La Palma. None was even offered. This is Martin Bell for the 6 o'clock news in El Salvador.
Martin, you mentioned the formidable obstacles, and indeed fighting has flared again. What does that say about this process?
Well, what it says is that the process, in a sense, depends on the continuing war to make it work. A ceasefire is, of course, necessary, but unless the pressures of the war are being felt, and it's the first time I've been covering this place since 1979. This is the first visit I've ever made in which the military situation was better for the government than it had been the time before. And this does put pressure on the guerrillas to come back to the negotiating table. But without the continuing war, you wouldn't get a peace process.
A final question on this. Do you agree with that evaluation? Both of you have been down in Central America recently. Let's find out your evaluation here, Jenny.
Well, I think obviously Martin's right in talking about the need for continuing pressure. At the same time, part of the success of the La Palma talks were the enormous public relations impact, and I think that's going to be very badly diluted by the continuing war. And after that, who knows what you're going to get.
Dieter?
Well, I also think that you have to exert pressure in order to get the process going on. But the means that are applied at the moment seem to be insufficient.
Okay, let's look at a different aspect of the tension in Central America. An uncertain welcome for the United States in Honduras. Last year, a major training area for America's friends, Salvadoran troops and anti-Sandinista rebels. Dieter, what I'd like to find out is that changing now in Honduras?
Well, after 1 year, the Americans are much more cautious about their ways down there, and they have reason to do that, because even the patient population down there seems to develop kind of an animosity of being the center of so many agencies going through their homeland.
Let's take a look at your report on Honduras. It aired on ZDF in Germany, and Dieter has translated it into English.
The impoverished yet gentle people seem resistant to the fighting all around. Honduras is like the eye of the hurricane, to Washington strategists ideally suited as the new bastion against communism in Central America. An interest reflected in the size of the American embassy here and the larger-than-usual role played by U.S. Ambassador John Negroponte, an interest he is careful to downplay.
Our presence in Honduras numbers about 1,000 American military personnel located almost entirely in areas removed from large urban centers. And the presence is very localized and isolated, so that I don't think it has an impact, a serious impact on the daily lives of the Honduran people.
Compared to last year, when the U.S. was utilizing large-scale maneuvers to lengthen airstrips, improve storage facilities and set up radar sites, two things are apparent. American activities have been scaled down, and that which remains is less accessible to the press. At Palmarola Air Force Base, even the airstrip is off-limits to the camera, restrictions imposed by the Honduran High Command. Since the recent change in military leadership here, greater effort has been made not to look like Washington's clones. Not the Stars and Stripes, but the host country's flag flies over the camp. A display of sovereignty not unwelcome to a Washington engaged in campaign politics. Still, in places like Puerto Castilla, America's presence over the past year is hard to ignore. Thousands of Hondurans and El Salvadoran soldiers have been trained in guerrilla warfare by American advisors. But old animosities run deep, and Honduras recently halted further training of troops from El Salvador until border disputes are resolved. Following right after the recent closing of the School of the Americas in Panama, U.S. strategists must now also redefine the role of this regional training center.
We have not taken, that I know of,
also the Contras, U.S.-supported rebels fighting the regime in Nicaragua, are not immune to the change in political climate. They too must worry about overstaying their welcome in Honduras. Growing impatience with foreign operations of any sort in Honduras might not only arrest the ambitions of U.S. strategists, but curtail America's interest in increasing economic aid to Central America's poorest country. Honduras would pay sorely for the price of national pride.
Dieter, I'm wondering, has the U.S. ability to influence events in Central America declined in the last year, in your view?
I don't know whether it has declined. It is not as offensive anymore. I mean, we don't have the large-scale maneuvers we had a year ago, as this little film showed, little item showed. They try to be less obtrusive, but they try to apply other means. And the question is how successful they can be. By other means, I mean, for example, the Contras, or I mean, perhaps for us, hidden counterintelligence measures, and of course also to apply mediators, third parties like Colombia, Mexico, the Contadora process.
Yes. Has the United States lost control, in effect, over that? Has that sort of taken off on its own in your view? Martin, Jenny?
I don't think it's taken off on its own. But I do think that the Americans have always overstated their influence in Central America and their ability to make quick moves which have quick effects. There's a saying in Central America, I think, that the Americans never remember and Central America never forgets. And I don't think America is ever aware of or is sensitive enough to the problems within countries and between countries.
Also, I think that to some extent there's been an end run down around the law here. These exercises have been going on for a year and a half of military maneuvers. I mean, let's not be kidding ourselves. What this is about is putting the lid on the security situation in El Salvador in particular. And although, as Dieter's piece showed, it's much more discreet, this presence, it's done what it was set out to do by aerial surveillance. It's stopped the Salvadoran rebels massing in numbers, and they haven't mounted a serious, effective military offensive since January. It's to that extent, it's full of political risks, but militarily it's worked.
Dieter, when people in your country think about America's role in Central America, do they consider it good, bad, a success, a failure?
Well, first of all, this is very much of an item of discussion in German politics itself. You have a very fervent interest in what is taking place in Latin America, and one party, political party, is taking sides with the opinion, let Central America solve its own problems, and the other party thinks if it belongs to any hegemony, then it belongs to the United States. And at the very moment we have a situation where our foreign policy tends to increase its own influence in the area. There was a recent assembly of the EC Secretaries of State down in Costa Rica, and they were talking about the Central American situation and even offering aid to Nicaragua, which is of course something the United States doesn't like very much.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to change subjects, if I can, to talk about some of the political ramifications of this election year. One of the interesting developments this year has been the broad support President Reagan has enjoyed among young people. A recent Washington Post ABC poll showed that among voters under 30 years of age, Reagan led Mondale 2-1, 31 to about 38%, something like that. Jenni has written on this for her paper, the Sydney Morning Herald. She noted that this oldest and most conservative of presidents, Reagan, gets his strongest support from the youngest voters. Jenni, why do you think that's so?
Well, there's obviously a variety of reasons. One is that the younger voters have two memories of presidents. One is Reagan and one is Carter. And I think the antipathy towards Carter is hard to overstate amongst young people. They do like the idea of the strong leader that Reagan presents, and also the idea of the simple, strong answers. The other point is, of course, the economic factor. And the Democrats are associated in the 76 period with inflation and a type of weakness. In 1980 to 84, or 1984 at least, they're very enthusiastic about Reagan's message of optimism and economic hope for the future.
Well, some people have taken it a step further, Jenni, and said that that really what a lot of this young support boils down to is an expression of the Me Too generation. They want the material goodies that come with economic progress, and they're giving Republicans the credit for it. Would you go that far?
Well, I think obviously that's got a lot to do with it. Though remains to be seen whether or not this is going to continue, and whether you're going to have people who are now young voting for Republican throughout their life, or whether they'll move around. I mean, obviously, if the recession comes if another recession comes within another couple of years, the attitude towards the Republicans and economic policy will be somewhat different.
Well, but only somewhat different, because there's also accompanying this process is the re-evaluation of historical values. I mean, if you talk to students in the Ivy League universities or at Duke University, where I just recently have been in North Carolina, you find out that there is a change of the pattern in moral values. If you look at the churches, the young people go to churches much more than they used to. They are not opposing so much governments, but they are trying to propose something of their own. They are much more optimistic of the future. They try to follow lines that go back to the forefathers that landed about 400 years ago. The only curious thing I found out is there's a lack of comprehension, or even a lack of knowledge of American politics in the 20th century. I mean, even Kennedy is an antique for them. They really start with Vietnam.
Martin, is it a short memory among Americans that you find as well? Do you agree with Dieter?
I do entirely. I find this a fascinating, wonderful, and extraordinary country to work in, insulated as it is by these two huge oceans on either side, which seem to protect people from an awareness of the world about them. And I find this new tide of American nationalism difficult to understand, even more difficult to explain to an American audience. I agree with the point being made about Carter. I think history is going to be very kind to Carter, but politics surely is very cruel to him, and this is a difficult moment to explain, certainly for us foreigners.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to change the subject one more time to let our viewers have a chance, because each week we feature a toss-up question suggested by viewers who write to me. This week our toss-up question is from Mrs. P. Duraja of Rockville, Maryland.
What do your guests think of the image TV and movies project to foreign people? Is Dallas really like that in America?
Jenny, let me ask you, in Australia, do they think Dallas represents what America is like?
Yes, I think they do. There's very much an image of America as full of big cities, of being very brash and slick, which is, people always express surprise when they come here and they go to the small towns of America.
Martin, do you have a view in England that we're cities, or do you have the Wild West and the guy on the horseback, or is that gone now?
I think if you take it from the soap operas and the TV series, America is a country of tremendous glamour and tremendous violence, and the two of them are immensely attractive for different ways to people all over the world. But it is a misconception of what life here is, but it comes from the United States.
Let me ask Dieter about this violence. Do you find us to be a violent society in our entertainment?
Well, Dallas and Denver project images to Germany that are counterproductive to what is really taking place in this country. And therefore, I think they're not useful.
You're very unfair to yourselves, really. I mean, there's so much more, it's so much better than that it seems to be on Dallas.
And you also heard our work. If we want to find understanding for what is taking place in the United States, and they look at Dallas and Denver.
Okay, well, if you have a question, write to me, and want to pose it to a foreign journalist, write to me, Ford Rowan, International Edition, Maryland Public TV, Owings Mills, Maryland, 21117. That's International Edition, Maryland Public TV, Owings Mills, Maryland, 21117. Include your phone number in your letter. Our final segment this week is a look at Soldiers of Fortune. Martin covered a convention in Las Vegas for mercenaries and would-be mercenaries. Here's his report.
Mercenaries met on the Strip in Las Vegas, where the most dangerous enemy they would encounter would probably be the one-armed bandit. But out in the desert, a camel's ride or so from their hotel, they were about more serious business. It was an arms exhibition and live firing exercise before a crowd of people who had been or wished to be soldiers of fortune, or who just identified with them. The would-be mercenaries were mostly ex-servicemen and not all of them Americans. The visitors included a former captain of the Rhodesian Selous Scouts, now living in military retirement in South Africa.
The whole show is put together by Soldier of Fortune, which denies being a magazine for mercenaries, but gives more than editorial support to regimes fighting communist insurgencies.
Peter Kakales, on the staff of the magazine, served alongside the Atla Cattle Battalion in El Salvador as more than just a war correspondent. What the battalion needs, he says, is 30mm cannon. And John Donovan, once a Special Forces major, has also been a participating reporter in El Salvador.
I'm an explosive technician, and anyway, it's where I have an area of a certain amount of expertise, and we spent time with certain units of the Salvadoran Army in the use of explosives and how to set certain explosive devices up and ambushes and counter ambushes. Because of the shortage of advisors, because of the restrictions placed upon Congress, we're actually filling a void.
There are elements of fantasy, too. An ultralight aircraft which is to be equipped with a machine gun. Machine guns are already carried on this dune buggy, a fast attack vehicle for zapping communists. The Soldiers of Fortune have a surprising freedom of maneuver and plans to bring their firepower to bear on other targets than a hillside in Nevada.
Martin, for people in Britain who watched that report, what do you think their reaction was? What do they think about the United States after they saw that?
I think they thought it was a bit of an odd country. I got some very angry reactions from the left in Britain, which said, why are you giving publicity to these people? Who are these fine friends of yours? There was a lot of bewilderment and confusion, and I think hostility, too, in Europe to this kind of activity.
What do you, as an Australian, Jenny, let me ask you, in your country, would there be groups like this?
No, no groups like that. I mean, there are occasionally some independent people who will go off to other parts of the world, but no, the general Australian reaction to this is one of complete shock, and really, there's no support for it at all.
Well, sort of a final word, Dieter, I'm just wondering, from a German perspective, looking at this, do you say this country, America, is a violent one that's prone to do things like intervene in other countries, even on a private basis?
Well, it's an ugly showcase in favor of democracy. I'd rather go along with that than with countries where people like that would be behind bars.
You'd rather see them have the freedom to do that?
Yes.
Martin, do you agree, or would you say those kind of people in your country would be prosecuted?
I think one of the great tributes to this country is its freedom to give an unfavorable image of itself abroad.
Which it does often.
Does it really have a bad image? Does the United States have a bad image abroad?
Well, it certainly has a much worse image than America likes to think of it.
And is it justified?
Yes, I think it is. I think, obviously, in many circumstances, they do the wrong thing. Just as many others, they do the right thing.
But a lot of Americans that are watching are saying, well, we do the right things most of the time. Why do you guys pick on us when we do something that doesn't seem right to you?
Well, Americans have always loved to be loved, probably more than most other countries in the world. And they can't understand that the American way is not the way for the rest of the world.
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, this is an open society. And even the ugly sides of this society show that it's a democracy. And in my eyes, this makes it one of the most favorable countries in the world.
Well, on that upbeat note, I think we'll call it a day. Thank you very much, Dieter, for being with us. And Jenny, I appreciate it. Martin, thank you for joining us. You've said some provocative things, and I know that we'll have you back to follow up on that. And I hope our viewers will phone in or write in with some questions if they have it for you or for other panels. Among the stories we will cover next week is a look at whether it is easier to find out information in the United States than in other countries. We'll hear some different opinions, so join us for another look at how we look to the world. I'm Ford Rowan. Thank you for joining us.
International Edition was made possible in part by the Hilton Hotels Corporation, America's business address, and its subsidiary, Conrad International Hotels, the world's business address, and by the members of Maryland Public Television.
Keep in touch with Maryland. News Wrap looks beyond the headlines next, followed by a Gronsky and Company.
International Edition is a production of Maryland Public Television, which is solely responsible for its content.